Good evening and welcome to We've Got Issues, a fun evening of WTF. We're here in Douglas College and we're giving a public presentation with the intent of people coming together. We're here with our first presenter, Donald Gutstein. He's the author of The Big Stall, How Big Oil and Think Tanks are Blocking Action on Climate Change in Canada. And it's a fascinating conversation about how we are being blocked in the information, and that's really what we're trying to get at today. So with regards to your presentation, Donald, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've been talking about today.
Well, as the title says, how big oil has been blocking action on climate change, and it's been going on for 50 years. And we want to look at how they've achieved that and continue to be able to stop meaningful action on climate change. We also want to look at the role of civil society, environmentalists, Indigenous peoples, farmers, unions, all kinds of organizations that are trying to slow down and stop the growth of the emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and the continuing increase of global warming. And so what we want to look at is all of the successes, the strategies that big oil has used over the years to make sure that it gets what it wants by focusing on the pressures it puts on government, and how civil society has been put on the defensive, really only being able to say stop, defend, resist, protect, when what people need to do is to come up with new ways of looking at the economy, ways that do not involve the increasing emissions of carbon, burning of fossil fuels.
So that people aren't paying the cost for what? Well, the big oil companies.
Yeah, people are paying the cost, not only the cost of buying and using the oil, but the cost of the carbon pollution, which is increasingly leading to, I don't like to think of it, a more uninhabitable planet. That's the cost that our children and grandchildren will have to pay unless it's changed pretty quickly.
Unless we do something. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And those are the kind of conversations we need to have. So I hope what will come of this, you'll enjoy this conversation, and you'll come back and listen to more and watch more, or join us at Douglas College for events in the future.
So the question that we're going to be asking tonight, what we've all been waiting for, is why does Canada seem incapable of taking effective action during the current climate crisis? And it's a question that I know a lot of us have been asking for a very long time. So that's the first question. We're going to start looking into it a little bit deeper. And with that, I'm delighted to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, who's Donald Gutstein. Donald taught in the School of Communication at SFU for 30 years. He specialized in documentary research, information policy, and news media analysis. As co-director of Newswatch Canada, he studied double standards and blind spots in corporate news media reporting and analysis. So Donald has written 6 books. Before The Big Stall was Harperism, How Stephen Harper and his think tank colleagues transformed Canada, and Not a Conspiracy Theory, which is about the pervasiveness of corporate propaganda in modern democratic society. So one theme underlines Donald's work: how business influences government to make decisions that benefit business rather than citizens and the public. It raises questions about what we can do to ensure that democracy prevails. So we can see this phenomenon operating in spades with climate change. Donald argues at international, national, and provincial levels. So from the very first meeting about global warming at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 to the Wet'suwet'en resistance of today, whatever happened to Royal Dutch Shell, the LNG proponent? Big Oil has framed the debates. So Donald will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. And then we'll have some wrap-up comments from Brad. So please join me in welcoming Donald Gutstein.
We'll put that. Well, thank you very much, Nancy and Brad. Thank you for coming up with the idea for this series. I think it's a great idea, and thank you all for coming for the first episode. I think honest conversation is becoming a rare commodity, so if we were able to engage in it here, so much the better. We've got issues. Well, do we ever? And of course, climate change is at the top of my list of issues, and I suspect for many of you as well. Climate change, global warming, call it what you will. The Earth's environment spiraling out of control. If we're in a climate crisis, a climate emergency, where are the first responders? 50 years ago, big oil and government scientists first realized that carbon dioxide emissions, we called the greenhouse effect in those days, would lead to global warming of 2 degrees Celsius or more. 30 years ago, global warming became a public issue when the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to study and monitor global warming, and the Rio Earth Summit to do something about it. 15 years ago, some governments began imposing carbon taxes and subsidizing clean growth. 5 years ago, 194 nations signed the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 2 degrees and to aim for a target of 1.5 degrees. And yet in 2020, where are we? Atmospheric CO2 emissions, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, reached a level of 415 parts per million, a level not seen since the Middle Pliocene era 3 million years ago, and shows no sign of abating. 350 parts per million is considered a safe level, the upper limit to which life on Earth has become accustomed. It was breached first in 1990, just as the United Nations was gearing up to start the whole global warming procedures. This slide shows the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere each year. In 2019, it reached its highest level ever at 36.8 billion tons. You can look at this graph and see the orange part at the top, which is China, and blame China. But if coal is being burned to produce electricity, to power factories that are producing iPhones for the American market, who is really to blame for the emissions? It really is a global problem. Here's another version of that same graph showing a more realistic timeline on the bottom. You can see how dramatic it's been since the 18th century. And then there's methane, a second long-lived greenhouse gas, which adds another 20% to global warming. How did this happen? Why do we continue to burn fossil fuels with their known consequences when alternatives are available and cheap? I'm sure each of you has a pretty good take on this. Tonight, I'd like to give you my analysis of why it happened and how difficult it is to do anything about it. Difficult, but not impossible if we get our analysis right. COVID-19 is slashing carbon dioxide emissions far more than 15 years of carbon taxes and clean energy subsidies. So you got to ask yourself, what do we need to do to turn the tide around? The second one is what happened this week when Saudi Arabia and Russia went to war with each other about boosting the output of oil. And that caused a dramatic cut in the cost of oil, leading to the stock exchange meltdowns. And so cheap oil should be a good thing, but it's got two sides to it. If oil is so cheap, it could undercut the value of renewable energy. It could be cheaper than renewable energy, so we might not end up ahead. So there are two questions in my presentation tonight. Why has big oil been able to resist meaningful action on climate change for 50 years and counting? And second, why hasn't civil society been able to make more headway in countering the increased use of fossil fuels? There's one more factor that is essential in my analysis of this whole situation, and that's the role of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in my view, is how big oil took over the world. There are many definitions, but mine is, it's the ideology that says that the role of government is to create and enforce markets and prop them up when they fail. And we've seen this many times before. It's not like libertarianism, whose goal is for government just to get out of the way and let the market carry on. Neoliberalism is very different. In the neoliberal view, markets and only markets are capable of increasing the prosperity of all of mankind. Government intervention in the market will invariably fail and people will suffer. So that's kind of the bottom line. Neoliberalism puts individual liberty and responsibility first and besmirches collective action. Inequality and poverty are not problems in the neoliberal world. They are evidence the market is working. If markets aren't working, create more markets. Create a market for clean technology. Create a market for carbon capture. Modify existing markets with carbon taxes. These are all good for investment, but do not address the fundamental issue of how to cut emissions to zero and fast. Neoliberalism became the dominant ideology in the 1980s, and it permeates every sector of society: government, business, academia, the media, and many apparently progressive organizations are hobbled by neoliberalism. Its existence makes it exceedingly difficult to make inroads on global warming, because markets cannot really solve global warming. We've been blinded by neoliberal ideology to solutions that can actually work, like stringent government regulation in the public interest. And I'll look at that a bit later. So big oil, what we're looking at now is big oil versus civil society with neoliberalism as the referee. And this is a pretty unfair contest. This is the board of directors of Royal Dutch Shell meeting in their head office in The Hague, Netherlands. In 2018, these people approved the company decision to proceed with the $40 billion project of LNG Canada in Kitimat. John Horgan could have set up a crown corporation to vastly expand renewable energy economy. Instead, he provided subsidies for big oil. So that just shows you there are different options always available. Then Royal Dutch Shell hired TransCanada Energy to build a pipeline connecting the fracked gas fields of northeastern BC with Kitimat. And here's the other side of the contest. Armed police with weapons and dogs ready to breach the barricades set up with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs to prevent unlawful trespass on their traditional territory. So let's look at big oil successes. I don't know if you can see this is a wonderful cartoon from the New Yorker magazine, and it says, "And so while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit." So that's kind of a mindset that we need to look a bit more closely at. So while we're talking about the world's most important commodity, big oil will do and has in the past done whatever it takes to gain access to the resource and obtain favorable terms. This slide portrays the 1953 overthrow of the Iranian government as an example of big oil's dirty history. This coup against the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh was engineered by the American CIA and the British MI6. Mossadegh's crime was that he had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, later known as BP, British Petroleum, to benefit the Iranian people and not big oil. His ouster was aimed at ensuring that the Iranian monarchy would safeguard the West's oil interests in the country. And he did so until the 1979 Iranian Revolution, 1979 Iranian Revolution. The way Royal Dutch Shell has done business can best be seen in Nigeria, where the charges against the company range from oil spills to corrupt practices to the execution of Nigerian activists like Ken Saro-Wiwa and a brutal crackdown by Nigeria's military police to protect Shell's oil concessions. And the court cases that have been brought up by Shell's action are ongoing today. There's multiple court cases in various courts in Europe trying to bring the company to account for a lot of these issues. Now, we're not likely to see the killing of 1,000 resistors and the destruction of 30,000 homes in British Columbia to suit Shell's ambitions. But Shell and big oil have other ways of getting what they want. Global warming became an issue in 1988 when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up, and James Hansen, the climate scientist, testified before the United States Senate that he was 99% sure that global warming was here. The same year, enormous heat waves, droughts brought global warming to public attention. The very next year, globally as well as in Canada, and I'm going to just look at Canada for now, big business immediately rose to the challenge, resolving to take the lead on responses. If corporate leaders do not seize the initiative and define environmentalism, others will, and business will have to live with the results. So Tom D'Aquino, which was the head of the Business Council of Canada, which has had different names over the years, but it's an organization of 150 chief executive officers. And because energy is such a large part of the Canadian economy, the oil executives always played a leading role in this organization. So over the next 2 decades, what big oil and big business did together was, first of all, deny that global warming was happening at all. This was a massive effort perpetrated by dozens of neoliberal think tanks, such as the Fraser Institute here in Vancouver, and all across the world, denying that it was happening and that any increases in CO2 would be good for agriculture and stuff like that. It still resonates today as a significant minority of the Canadian and American populations still believe in it. And of course, I don't need to mention the president and vice president of a neighboring country are still deniers. We don't call them skeptics, because skeptic sort of implies that you've thought about it a lot and, well, I'm a bit skeptical about that evidence, but I believe this. No, it's just out and out denial. You don't care what the evidence is, it's a political position. So that happened, and that held back any action on climate change for quite a while. Then when it was becoming clear that global warming was indeed happening, they switched to voluntary measures, claiming that industry was best positioned to deal with emissions. This argument was bought by the Jean Chrétien government, delaying meaningful action for another decade. Then when in 2007, and this was a turning point, the voluntary approach was seen to have been an utter failure. At the same time, the Intergovernmental Panel's 4th assessment report came out claiming greater certainty about global warming, and the global financial meltdown also happened that year. So business came up with a new strategy. Admit that global warming might be happening, but it isn't a threat, but an opportunity for further growth and profit. This is a framing that the Justin Trudeau government has diligently followed. This was accompanied with carbon pricing proposals. Now, in my view, the purpose of carbon pricing is not to seriously address global warming, but to ensure governments don't take decisive actions that would negatively affect fossil fuel companies. It just becomes another cost of doing business for oil companies, and they've been factoring in a price for carbon for years. Meanwhile, it takes attention away from kind of direct government regulation in the public interest to forbid emissions above a certain level. And so that brings me to the Paris Agreement. Now, I put this here. I had a coup in Iran in 1953. In my view, there was a coup in Paris in 2015. The chapter in my book is titled Paris, Big Oil Gets Its Deal. And so what I'm arguing is Big Oil came away with exactly what it wanted. And here we are today, desperately trying to achieve those targets that were set out in the Paris Agreement. So let me try and explain that a bit. So here's a Shell oil executive who's saying that Shell influenced the Paris Agreement, especially about Article 6, actually getting it into the agreement. Now, I know articles and so on, but this story came out after my book was published, and it helped confirm for me that my analysis was correct. Article 6 should not have been in the agreement, but it is. What it does, in legalese, it lays out rules for country that choose to engage in a voluntary basis on transferring their targeted limits. Okay, in plain English, it authorizes countries to participate in carbon markets as a means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by buying credits from other countries. And it's sponsored by the International Emissions Trading Association, a worldwide network of oil companies, banks, consultancies, big businesses that are promoting these kind of markets. Now, Shell and British Petroleum couldn't have been part of the official delegations in Paris because only governments could do that. But they had Canada's Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, and she co-chaired the Article 6 committee, which took what the International Emissions Trading Association wanted and got it inserted into the Paris Agreement as sort of an end run around the whole process. Environmentalists didn't have this kind of access, nor did Indigenous people and unions, farmers, or any of the other public interest sectors that were present in Paris. Only big oil and its allies. So why would McKenna do this? Because even at this early date, it looked like Canada wouldn't be able to meet its intended nationally determined targets, or the level it was hoping to achieve. So Article 6 could be the escape hatch. Trudeau and then Premier Rachel Notley had secretly met, which I detail in the book, and they agreed to let the Alberta tar sands increase their production by 40%. And that would mean there's no way you're going to be able to cut your carbon emissions if they're going up by that amount. So Article 6 can be very convenient for the Canadian government. So after Trudeau and Horgan approved LNG Canada with its known amount of CO2 emissions that will be discharged over the years, that they couldn't reach the climate goals because they can always buy their way out. And I think that's what is the story that's going on here. They don't need to meet them. And that's because the next item in the Paris Agreement is Article 4. And Article 4, the draft agreement of Article 4 said that developed country parties shall continue taking the lead by undertaking economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. Well, shall is pretty clear. But the final treaty, developed country parties should continue taking the lead by undertaking economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. From shall, you must do, to should, hey, it would be good if you did this. French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who was president of the summit and apparently somewhat of a jokester, called the change a hiccup, a typo, as if somebody in the back room didn't know the difference between shall and should. But the reality was that the United States would never support a deal with mandatory emissions because the Republican-controlled Senate would never support it. And the Republican-controlled Senate wouldn't support such a deal because its fossil fuel backers would never allow it. Blackmail from big oil removed from the agreement one of the most potent weapons available for fighting climate change, mandatory emission levels. Instead, we're stuck with a weasel word, ambitious. Like in, let's be ambitious people and try to do better, as opposed to do this or go to jail, right? So it was a pitiful excuse for strong action. The third reason why I say Paris was what big oil wanted, it was because big oil was even part of the inner workings. Big oil was allowed to sponsor, pay for the hearings, the treaty. I picked the example of Engie, which is Europe's largest natural gas and coal producer, the world's 8th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And yet it was invited by the government of France to be part of the inner workings and to help move big oil's agenda forward. So I just want to contrast what happened in Paris, because you might think, well, isn't that the way all these conferences work? But I want to contrast with the 2003 World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Tobacco interests were expressly excluded, and that helps explain the treaty's rapid progress in curtailing tobacco use. It says there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's interests and public health policy interests. And this convention was adopted after only 3 years of discussion. Contrast that with, what are we on, the 26th or 28th Conference of the Parties now, and hardly any progress is being made. Now, there's obviously big differences between secondhand smoke and carbon dioxide emissions. They occur at vastly different levels. But for neoliberals, they share a common problematic. Society wants to solve them through government regulation and action, and this must be resisted by all means available, because, remember, only the market can make the right decisions. In Paris, civil society showed up in record numbers, but they were largely relegated to the margins. They had been outgunned by big business, which had been organizing for over 5 years to bring all the different interests together with a common voice, a common set of demands. And they were, and by infiltrating the talks as well. Big business worked its way into the conference and came out with pretty much what it wanted. So Justin Trudeau and Catherine McKenna returned from Paris in December 2015 with a goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. At this point, the Liberals had only been in office for just over 2 months. Yet within a year, after consultation with the provinces and territories, Trudeau came out with his plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. It's quite an accomplishment to be able to achieve this in just over a year. This framework has been much discussed, obviously, but the Big Stall's contribution to the discussion is to demonstrate that the plan did not appear out of thin air. Remember back in 2007 when big oil and big business pivoted from voluntary efforts to it's happening, but let's let the market deal with it. In that year, the Business Council of Canada produced its own report called Clean Growth, Building a Canadian Environmental Superpower. What I found most remarkable was the similarities between these two documents, 9 years apart. Aside from a focus on clean growth, a declaration that growth will continue, whatever clean comes to mean, the parallels in the documents are remarkable. The chief executives demanded a coherent national plan of action. Trudeau delivers a pan-Canadian framework. Not quite a national plan, but on the way. The chief executives ask for investment in new technologies. Trudeau delivers investment in clean technologies. The chief executives demanded price signals, such as emissions trading or carbon tax, and that's exactly what Trudeau delivers. Coincidence? Hardly. During the 9 years between the chief executive's document and the government's return to a brief bout of Keynesianism, and then returning to neoliberalism, which emerged stronger than ever. Now neoliberalism threatens to destroy the planet. Threatens to destroy the planet in order to save the market. We can't let that happen. Is the Green New Deal an idea whose time has come? I certainly hope so. Thank you.
I want to know really clearly the concept of neoliberalism.
Almost all governments are neoliberal these days. And that's because the ideas have become common sense. If you can remember back before the 70s, 80s or 70s, we used to have crown corporations, we used to have government involvement in the economy and doing all kinds of things. That became verboten under neoliberalism, and only the market could be allowed to be part of the economy. And it doesn't matter, I'd say all three major federal parties maybe are not entirely neoliberal, but are governed by neoliberal thinking.
Yeah, I had the opportunity of living in Australia for a short period of time.
Yes.
And they went by the name of rationalization. That's the same thing too.
Yes, it is.
And I think other places called it neoconservatism at times. So those are all names of the same thing, right?
Neoconservative is a bit different. It's more about social issues, whereas neoliberalism is mainly about economic issues.
What they say, rationalizing.
Yeah, that would be neoliberal, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I have been very actively involved in the past 4 or 5 years now in waste to energy, which is generating renewable energy and fighting climate change actively in the front line. I just want to thank you for sharing this message tonight, which is very real. Climate change is very real. I would like to encourage everybody to watch a video in YouTube called Breakthrough in Renewable Energy.
Is there some other ways our government could be going?
From where I see it, the governments are investing billions of dollars in clean energy, renewable energy, lots of money, and to try to bring down the emission intensity of the tar sands. So they're doing lots of things in that regard, but there's no policy behind them. There's no massive effort, massive focus that would need to happen for it to be effective. Because with all of that, the CO2 emissions are still going up. So there's something wrong when you do the equation there. So it's too late. I mean, they've known about this for 50 years, but that needs to be way more scaled up than what we're seeing.
Without taking away from the subject that you're talking about, but something that we're interested in is this breakdown of the conversations that get between the people and what they needed to happen 30 years ago and what's going on right now. What is that? And Jackie's company has had trouble breaking through, and yet you were speaking of lobbyists earlier. Is that the only thing that's standing in the way, or is it primarily that machine?
PR, public relations industry, and the way they monitor social media for people critical of the oil and gas industry, and then target them. You know, so how can you have a conversation when there's that kind of aggressive attack happening on people who are just trying to have a conversation?
I always believed in polluter pay, so I was surprised to hear you speak about your problems with the carbon tax. If you were to suggest something to the federal government, what might that be as opposed to carbon tax?
If people had to pay the full cost of the CO2 emissions, the economy would be dead in a day. Like we're talking $30 a ton or $50 a ton. I think you have to look at $400 a ton, which was in order to like Arthur Pigou, who sort of created the theory of externalities. He said we should charge the polluter and charge those who are doing harmful things and subsidize those who are doing good things. So like he would say, give people who are going to school, give them subsidies because they're doing things that are going to be good for the economy. People who are polluting, they need to pay the full cost, and that's the thing. Like the full cost would just bankrupt most companies. They've been allowed to get away with it for decades. And you can't just all of a sudden say, boom, you know, you have to pay $400 a ton.
So are you advocating for carbon tax, but the money being used for more favorable green energy projects? Is that what
that's certainly one way to go, and I know that's what some proposals have done, and that's good. But too often, what's ended up happening is because the federal government is returning all of the carbon tax money to the people who did the polluting in the first place. And I've been thinking about this for years, and I don't get it. Okay.
It's a great talk. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the New Deal, because I think that whole question about waste and the carbon tax, I mean, I understand that you're thinking carbon tax needs to have regulations along with it, but we're always kind of stuck in that neoliberal problem of how we finance these things. And I realize that I don't know enough about the Green New Deal. Do you want to talk for a few minutes about that?
Well, it's a direction, let me say this, because as I try to find out what it really is, and there's lots of promises and visions of what it could be, but when I actually brought the NDP, federal NDP, New Deal for Climate Action and Good Jobs, but when you try to read this critically, it just says, you know, end oil and gas company subsidies. Well, that's a really good thing to do, and invest in renewable energy. So, like, what does that mean? How do you invest? Do you set up a government organization that just like they did BC Hydro, they have a renewable energy authority? Or do you just give incentives to existing companies? So I don't know what they mean. And I think that's important. That would be my next task would be to try and dig into that a bit more, but I'm sorry I can't. But you see what I'm saying there, that every one of them has a vagueness to it.
And I guess what you're saying is that there needs to be some direct route by which the people, civil society would benefit from whatever it is we need to do to bring down the global emissions.
Well, precisely, it's for the benefit of civil society, yes.
But I'm hoping that you can maybe dispel some of the misconceptions that I may have. It seems to me, if you look at the root cause of a lot of the problems we're seeing today, that go hand in hand with a global economy, goods that move around the planet at high cost of carbon. Localization seems to be one of the solutions that gets tossed around as addressing a lot of these concerns. We could produce more food locally, we could produce more goods locally. All of those things, however, seem to come at a much higher cost, and that cost is typically within our current economic climate, within our current economic system, is borne by those least able to afford it. And so that seems to be at odds with the notions of social justice, which are also important.
The 1970s, with the development of computers and rapid transportation, that created a whole new economy. And I'm not saying let's go back to the 1970s, but are all the costs being included when you say when you return to the local level, localization? What a global accounting, I don't think I know the answer to that, but I think that it's the costs of transportation, of all of these factors haven't really been costed out fully, and I'd like to see how they compare. So if you're suggesting that globalization is good because it creates cheaper goods, right? Is that?
That's the common perception. Mm-hmm. That if the resistance to localization is, well, things are going to cost more. So if you want to buy local produce, for example, you know you're going to have to pay twice as much for it.
Well, I'm not sure the dollar value, but sure. Well, that's a discussion that has to take place. There's also part of that is where do we put growth in this new vision? Do we continue to grow? I know, like when I started my research, I was looking at the 1970s when it's kind of the no growth movement, the planet ship Earth, all those kinds of things that were happening in the 70s, and they were totally elbowed out of the way in order for this global economy to take its place. So, yeah, you could probably say that there's a more, it's cheaper in some ways to do this, but we need to look at the overall cost to everybody. Thanks.
The fossil fuel subsidies are about $56 billion a year. So if you take that amount of money and redirect it into the resources we need to build on that economy, it does do a great deal to launch into a greener future. So that is part of the Green New Deal.
Yes.
But my question is more around the global atmosphere. So we have Harvard negotiated FIPA with China, and we have the TPP. We've suffered greatly under NAFTA, the most sued country in that agreement. And I wonder what your thoughts are around that. I once asked head of a political organization, not the main parties, but because he kept saying we just, we've got to just cancel all the contracts, and then the problem is that we will be massively sued for billions of dollars, and his answer was we don't pay. we just won't pay. So I just want to, I mean, I love the idea, but I mean, I don't know where that ends up in warfare, and what the end result would be catastrophic potentially, or could there be an agreement between countries? Could we not sit down at a table and just say, okay, enough is enough? Can we not work something out globally and economically? Have you thought about that?
I was just thinking about Donald Trump and the way he unilaterally imposes tariffs on other countries and then let them figure it out. So it can be done. These kinds of actions can be taken by, probably not by countries like Canada, which don't have that much clout globally, but I think you mentioned the taking away the subsidies, and yeah, that's a great idea, and it is right here in the Green New Deal.
To me, that kind of would solve the problem because the companies would fold, like you say. They would just they would throw it down right there. Without that money, I think they would be ready to walk away. But that's not I have this program to be fair and just transition. We want to transition workers so that they have training and capability to move on into greater opportunities. So it can't be done immediately, but I don't understand why there isn't a political will to get it done at all. It seems like, or at least in the nearest future possible. All I keep coming back to is agreements with China.
Well, I just think the governments don't even consider the possibility of moving outside the framework because it's dangerous out there, whereas we know what the consequences are when we give subsidies to fossil fuel industries, or if we give subsidies to renewable. We know how that works, but we can't do like what the original New Deal, what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. He just went in there and created huge bureaucracies and huge organizations to operate on a massive scale. I think that was the original vision of the Green New Deal, was to be like that, but it seems to have fallen by the wayside. Okay, thanks.
I happen to be a very strong supporter of the Green New Deal, and since it has only been recently introduced into the mainstream political landscape, many people are not aware of what it encapsulates. So I'm wondering what you believe the best way to approach and communicate what the Green New Deal says, while keeping it simple enough for the general public to understand.
The Green New Deal by itself as a political movement is great, is making some headway, but it must have the support of ideas, right? Of critiquing neoliberalism and creating arguments for why the Green New Deal is the way forward, which will create a new economy that will deal with both global warming and inequality. So I don't know how to simplify that. That's a good question, but I just see it in a broader sense that it's happening, but it's still only like one side of it. I don't know if there are economists working on Green New Deal issues. I would love to see that. I think that would be important. So I'm sorry, that's all I can say.
So that's it for our presentation this evening. Donald, I'd like to thank you so much. That was a fabulous conversation, and I think it's extremely informative for the people who've attended, and I think it's informative for people watching, people listening. These are the kind of conversations we need to have in the future. So I look forward to anyone getting a hold of us, coming to our events, watching, listening, commenting on what you've had a chance to see. And we'd like to also thank Tri-City Community TV for taking the time to come out on an evening like that and helping us bring this to more people. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.